Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Robert Pondiscio. I'm a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, an education policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. and in Ohio. And welcome to this discussion this afternoon. Just to start, I caution my fellow panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, that I'm a pretty poor choice of moderator for this particular topic. The work that I do at the Fordham Institute tends to focus on what happens inside of the classroom, on curriculum, on instruction. I've made kind of a career out of noting that education reform doesn't pay enough attention to what happens inside the classroom. We treat it like a black box and just measure what goes in and what comes out. So here it is today. We are talking quite literally about that box, about charter schools, about facilities funding, about the variety of mechanisms that states and policymakers have to address the facilities needs of the charter schools in their states. ExcelinEd has developed a tool that enables state policymakers to explore how best to address the needs of charter schools while minimizing the cost to states. Discussing that tool will be a large part of our conversation here over the next 45 minutes to an hour. But first, let me introduce our panelists. First is Indiana State Senator Eric Bassler and Matthew Joseph of ExcelinEd. Senator Bassler is a veteran of 6 years in the Indiana Senate. That's a part-time legislative body. So his day job, I guess, is a financial advisor for Edward Jones. He's also a father of 5, which that should be reason enough for him to have education at the center of his interests as a state lawmaker. Formerly on Indiana's Education Committee, he is now the chairman of the Senate's K-12 funding subcommittee. Also joining us is Matthew Joseph. Matthew is the policy director for education funding at ExcelinEd. He previously worked as a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he spearheaded a national initiative to improve strategic use of resources in public education. He also served as the executive director of Advocates for Children and Youth in Maryland, and spent time earlier in his career at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. He just published a paper at ExcelinEd that looks at how well Indiana specifically is meeting the facilities needs of its charter schools, along with the tool that I mentioned that will assist any state in evaluating how well they're doing on that score. Again, that will form a large part of what we talk about here in this session. A quick reminder to the audience, your questions are welcome and encouraged. On your screen, you should see the question box to your right. Do feel free to send up questions for either Senator Bassler, Matthew Joseph, or both, and we'll get to those later on in the session. I'm going to start by asking Senator Bassler to take us inside the discussion that states tend to have about facilities funding. But first, Matthew, since I've just confessed my general ignorance or maybe indifference about the facilities issue, so for folks like me who are deeply invested in reform, in charter schools, in improving outcomes for kids, start off in the broadest possible way. Tell someone like me why I should care about facilities and funding.
Well, it's a great question. And I think one of the reasons to care, if you care about instruction, is because there's different pots of money that charter schools have to address different needs. And if they're having to take a big portion of money to pay for their facilities, that money is coming from someplace. And that money is coming from what they would otherwise use for instruction. It's the case in Indiana that there's a discrepancy already on the operating side of $1,000 for charter schools. They're getting $1,000 less per student for the operating. That means that's everything they use to pay for instruction. Now, if they have a deficit on the facility side and they're having to take an additional $1,000, now you're talking about like a $2,000 deficit on the instruction side. So the things that folks care about for instruction, they're having to do with less money. So I think that it's because there's only one way to pay for facilities that charter schools have. They don't have access to other revenue streams that traditional districts have, that we want states to make sure that they are fully enabling to have affordable facilities.
Terrific, thank you. Senator Bassler, okay, we're going to try to make this conversation about more than just Indiana, but let's start by talking about Indiana. Take us inside of the legislative process. and talk about some of the main policies that state lawmakers have to meet the needs of charter schools in your state.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I guess if we could maybe back up and maybe take almost like a 30,000 foot.
I think we may have lost.
In many states, we have a budget. It's a biannual budget. So every 2 years we come up with the state budget. And so from the big picture, we're looking at the overall budget, and then we start drilling down. And so then we say, okay, when we look at K-12 funding, or maybe education even broader, when you think about higher ed, what are our goals as far as how much are we going to be able to allocate towards overall education? Of that, how much of it can we allocate towards K-12? In Indiana, for as long as I've been involved, and I think maybe for quite a while before that, somewhere over 50% of our state budget goes towards K-12 funding. And so then we start to kind of then get down into the layers of it, and and we have what we call a school funding formula that starts off with kind of a base funding level for every student. And then depending upon a complexity index, we then maybe provide additional dollars per student for children that would be in like low to moderate income households. But then there's other funding pots. So for example, there's additional funding for special education needs, for honors, for career and technical education. And so where the charter school funding comes in is part of that school funding formula. And so let's say they use a number of maybe let's call it about $6,300 per child is maybe the base amount that we will fund for literally every K-12 child in Indiana that is then allocated to their specific school, and whether it goes to a traditional public school, charter school. We also have vouchers that can be used for private schools. So that kind of determines the funding base. Now, one thing that we're charter schools, and we've been doing this for a number of years, we provide some facility funding. So the last budget, it was $750 per student that would go to charter school. They would get that additional funding that could then be used towards facilities, for example. So that kind of adds a very broad overview of how school funding works in the school funding formula. I don't want to get into a lot of minutiae, and I'd be happy to. It's just that it can get awfully dry and awfully detailed if I get much deeper than that, as far as the complexity index and things along those lines.
Yeah, no, I'm sure we'll unpack some of that when we talk about the ExcelinEd tool. You know, one other kind of broad question before we get into the weeds on this. My colleague at the Fordham Institute, Dale Chu, who's a former Indiana ed reform guy, just published a piece this morning about how his current city, Denver, has gone from something of an ed reform hotspot, but has now lost its way. I've written similar pieces in recent years, making the same observation about New York, where I live and work. So let's just get an awkward question out of the way early. When we talk about lawmakers meeting the needs of charter schools in their states, that assumes, right, that they're inclined to do so. Are they right now?
Yeah, I think it's a very legitimate question. Sometimes I think, I guess, varies from state to state on what kind of interest there is from a policymaker's perspective on continuing to try to work with education reform. And one thing I think we have to be a little bit careful of is when we use the word reform, so sometimes maybe people will assume that, okay, once we reform it, once it's done being reformed, then there's more work to be done. Okay, but I think that just as we continue to make advancements in all areas of society, we need to continue to make advancements when it comes to K-12 education. In some ways, I wonder if maybe we should come up with a better word than the word reform, because I think there is kind of an assumption that eventually we will be finished reforming, but really what we're talking about is improving. And I think there is again, it's going to vary from state to state, but I still think there's a fair appetite among policymakers in Indiana to continue to improve the K-12 education system. And just as an example, there's been a group of us senators that have been meeting for a while. Now the whole COVID thing has kind of slowed that process down, but we've had a lot of discussions on, and we're trying to force ourselves into thinking, okay, what does education look like, not next year, but what does it look like 10 years from now? One of the challenges I think elected officials have is there's a tendency to think in pretty short time frame, maybe a 2-year time frame, but probably 4 years at most. And part of that is because the election cycle. But what we're trying to do as a group is we're trying to say, okay, what should K-12 look like 10 years from now? And if it should look like, X 10 years from now, well, what should it look like 9 years from now in order to get to X in 10 years? And what should it look like in 8 years and 7 years, trying to back into it? Because I think there is an interest in continuing to kids and their families. I think there's a strong interest in that in Indiana, and I assume in many other states. One thing that I do think that I wish we did better in Indiana is get a more bipartisan support when it comes to education reform, education choice, things along those lines. Because I know some states have done an outstanding job, and I've attended some conferences where people come from many different states, and it is a bipartisan, or it's a nonpartisan issue in many states, and we just haven't done as good a job of that in Indiana as I'd like for us to be able to do, because then it becomes less, I guess, combative, if you will.
That's a great point. If I could just add to that just a little bit, which is, I think there is a broader framing of this has really come up in the pandemic, which is about equity and the fact that in the current environment, wealthier parents are exercising choice. They are having opportunities to weather the storm with their kid by sending their kids to private school or to public schools that are doing a better job. And many parents are looking to charter schools as one of those opportunities where they may find that a charter school is being more responsive or more likely to offer in-person instruction or higher quality hybrid instruction nowadays. And of course, even before the pandemic, charter schools in many states had long waiting lists. And the fact that the pandemic now is exacerbating that, which means that they're looking to have even more pressure on their facilities. And so that's one of the reasons why I think policymakers who really are concerned about equity and parents being able to make their choice are going to be thinking about how do they address facility needs. And the fact is, in the pandemic, charter schools, just like other public schools, are facing all of the same challenges, all the same public health restraints that other public schools have, that they're having to deal with ventilation, and they can't serve as many kids in their facilities. And so the traditional public schools are able to go back to the voters and say, we need extra money for our facilities. We can raise our local taxes to do that. But charter schools can't do that. They're entirely reliant on state policy to help them do that. And that's one of the reasons why it is important for state policymakers to understand how well are their various policies doing to address that need.
Good, right. Oh, and that's a great segue to the first question I wanted to ask you, Matthew. So let's talk about the tool and the study that you did for ExcelinEd. You determined, and this is from memory, so correct me if I've got it wrong, that the state of Indiana is meeting less than half, I think it was about 40% of the facilities needs of its brick and mortar charter schools. That sounds like an obvious big problem. So how'd you come up with that figure to start with?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that it started with the understanding that across the country, as I mentioned, the lack of access to affordable facilities is one of the biggest barriers to charter school sustainability and growth. And states have already adopted a whole bunch of policies to help charter schools meet their facility needs. There's oftentimes put into 3 buckets, one of which is providing direct per pupil funding to help charter schools pay for their rent. Another is access to no or low cost surplus buildings. And the third bucket is reducing the cost of financing so charter schools can purchase their own facilities. But the big question that everyone has is, how well are these policies actually helping on the ground? Suppose only one charter school in a state has ever accessed a surplus building, or the state has a facility grant program, but it hasn't received any funding in recent years, or the state is providing $400 per student, but it's only covering 25% of the rent. So the question is, when you take a look at the policies on the ground and you put them all together, we thought that state policymakers would want to know, how much is this actually meeting the need of charter schools in their state? And my great partner in this is Sam Duell, who leads our charter school policy work at ExcelinEd. And we wanted to say, like, if 5% of charter schools are in a surplus building, it's meeting 5% of the need. If a per student allotment is paying for 20% of the cost of renting, that's meaning 20% of the need. So then we totaled all this up into one figure, which is called the Charter School Facility Index. And an index of 100 means that a state would be addressing 100% of the facility needs of charter schools in their state. An index of 50 means that a state is only meeting half the need, and the charter schools are having to use other resources to meet the other half. And then we developed a tool that allows policymakers to go in and figure out, like, well, how could they better meet the needs of charter schools and their facilities in the states? They can improve a policy that's already in place but not working as well as it could, or they could bring in a new policy that's worked in other states. And so, as you said, Robert, I mean, when we pulled all that together in Indiana, we did find out that right now Indiana's total policies are meeting 40% of the need of charter schools in the state. And we can put into the chat the kind of background on the index, the report that is about Indiana, and the tool that was developed that allows policymakers and partners to go in and kind of play around and kind of figure out, like, what would they do and how much would it cost. I mean, some options cost more than others, so they can decide, tight fiscal times, these are the ones that could make the best difference for us. I can go into a little more, about the actual study, but I'll stop with that just in terms of finding.
No, I'd like you to, but I'm just curious for Senator Bassler. Was this news to you, or was this pretty much just confirm your view, or was?
Yeah, I wasn't entirely shocked by the report that came out, and because this has been an issue that we've been talking about for a number of years, and we're continuing to talk about is what is the appropriate level and how best to allow charter schools to thrive. Because one thing that I think is important, again, from a big picture perspective, is from a policymaker, someone who's involved with policy issues, my main concern is how best can we provide the best quality education for children. And I know that maybe we've got this sleeve of public schools, and people that are big on traditional public schools are going to be all in for traditional public schools. And there's the charter schools, and there's the private schools, there's the home schools and so forth, there's virtual schools. And quite often there's a tendency for us to kind of get in our silos. But from a policy perspective, I want to have as many choices as possible for children, and then for the children and their families to make a decision on how best is it to educate their child. And so that's been one of the discussion points we've had over the last budget, and the one before that is how can we provide some type of additional support that would allow charter schools to also thrive. And we do some additional funding. It's $750 per child. Like Matthew said, I think we have the situation where a charter school can buy a former school building that's no longer in use, but that's only taken place once in Indiana. We did have at one time a lending facility in place, but there were some challenges with that. One thing that I'll kind of give a plug for Matthew's tool that he referred to was, I would encourage, and I assume, and Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that anybody could have access to I believe you have a tool for Indiana. I think you've also maybe done it for Colorado, maybe California, Florida. I can't remember which states. But I guess answer this in just a minute with you, Matthew, if anybody can have access to those, because when I went in and really started just kind of hacking around, almost like you would with any technology tool, just go in and start plugging numbers in here and plugging numbers in there and make mistakes. And the thing I've found, I guess, most beneficial about the tool that he's referring to is it doesn't have to be kind of an all or none thing. It doesn't have to be, well, what if we did X? What impact is that going to be? Well, what if we did Y? What impact will that have? Well, what if we do Z? Well, it allows you to say, well, what if we did a little bit of X and a little bit of Y and a little bit of Z? What impact would that have with respect to charter schools and charter school facility funding? So that's probably what I like most about the tool. Is it's not like you can just have one thing you can tweak. There's multiple things you can tweak within that tool to show you the impact that it would have on charter school funding. So I don't know, Matthew, can everybody have access to those tools? Is that out on the internet somewhere, I guess, for anybody in the world to look at?
Yeah, the access to the Indiana tool, that's totally available. We put the link to that in the chat. It's on our website, and the Indiana study really was the first of its kind in the country. You know, we developed a prototype of this and we kind of gave examples from other states, but actually doing it, well, this was the first time we've done it. And it is very state specific. It is something that we work with a state partner. We were really fortunate to work with the Institute for Quality Education Indiana, which was a great source of information and support for the project, because it factors in what's the actual cost of facilities in the state and what are the policies that are currently in place in the state. Then the tool that the senator mentioned really allows policymakers to come in and kind of bring in a policy that is working in Colorado. Like, you know, there is an example like in Colorado where they do provide access, charter schools do get access to facility related local taxes. And so that's a huge difference, no cost to the state, but something that is hugely beneficial to charter schools. And so you can go to the tool and say, well, suppose charter schools in Indiana that make up 5.4% of the public school enrollment, suppose they only even got half of the local facility taxes. What difference would that make? There are other examples from like California where a huge percentage of charter schools are getting access to surplus buildings. You know, what would happen in Indiana if a much bigger percent of charter schools could do that? That, again, no cost to the state to do that. And finally, another thing that the tool allows you to see is what would happen. Like Arizona has a huge initiative to help charter schools get more affordable financing. So they lower the cost of the interest that charter schools are having to pay to purchase their own buildings, which is a huge benefit to charter schools. And again, the cost to the state is almost nothing, you know, and so that allows a policymaker to see, well, if I did this, it's 10% additional addressing of the need, and this is another 10%, just the way the senator describes is exactly how we would want that tool to be. But I think for other states, you know, if another state's interested, we would ask them to take a look at the Indiana tool and then reach out to an ExcelinEd. You know, we do this like free of charge, because we want to help state policymakers, but then we would tailor that to the state because we want to make sure it's specific to the costs of charter school facilities in that state and is addressing any unusual or specific issues that state policymakers would want to have in a tool like that. I think another thing, you know, that I think we've heard feedback is that when you see the index, it's just a number. You know, people want to understand, well, what does it really mean? What does it mean that the state is only addressing 40% of the need? And so you can see that what would a charter school be able to do if a state was doing a better job? And that was the thing that we mentioned at the very beginning, Robert, which that the gap is over $1,000 a student for charter school facilities. And in Indiana, that means that an average sized charter school could hire 8 additional teachers if they had those resources. That's a huge impact for students.
Yep. Well, that sounds to me, and maybe
yeah, Matthew, that was another thing that I liked about the tool was that it then converts that into what does that mean in real terms, like the how many additional teachers could there be? Then I guess you could then expand upon that and then say, okay, so that would therefore lower the student-teacher ratio to X. But so that was another thing that I liked about the tool. So I guess I would encourage people that are on this session right now, even if you're not from Indiana, you know, click on the link that Matthew is talking about and just kind of hack around with it and see exactly what that tool does and how easy it is to use. And then I guess give some consideration to if you're in education policy, which obviously people, I would think they're in education policy if they're in this session. They may see about getting a similar type tool developed for their specific state that would help them understand, you know, if you do move 2 or 3 different levers at once, what positive impact could that have? It was a very user-friendly tool.
The question that I would have for you, Matthew, and maybe this is too obvious, but it sounds to me, I walked into this assuming that this tool was for guys like Senator Bassler. It actually sounds like it could be of even greater use to folks in the advocacy space in individual states.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that advocacy folks in Indiana, for example, are getting access to that tool, and they could see the options, and then they can help the policymakers, you know, walk it through, because it is, you know, it's a tool, it's an Excel file, and so you have to kind of understand, you know, how to navigate that. But I think that it is helpful for everyone to understand when you pull together all these diverse policies that exist on paper, what's really happening. I mean, is it addressing 10%, 30%, 80% of the need? You know, I don't think most people in a state really know. There's nothing out there right now that they could go to help them understand, pull it all together. what's it really, how is this working on the ground? What portion is not being addressed? And then to pull in best practices from other states, because I think that's another thing that state partners ask us about, that at ExcelinEd, because we work in so many different states, what's working in other states that we can pull in to our state. And that's another thing the tool shows, because there could be a policy that doesn't even exist in the state. So it's a big zero in our tool, but the tool would say, well, let's bring it in to Indiana, and what impact would it have? The other thing that advocates are saying is that we're in tight fiscal times for the next few years. We need to know what's going to be the cost to the state, and which of these options really are things that we can go to policymakers and say, we know you don't have a lot of extra money. Here are things that you can do that actually don't cost the state much money at all. And can you at least do some of those things? And that's something that the tool has. It kind of shows impact on the state budget.
You know, Matthew, one thing that kind of surprised me when I was first saw your report and took over the tool was, I guess I was surprised that there weren't more charter schools that had taken advantage of the opportunity to purchase an older school building that's not in use anymore for $1. And I think, according to your research, I believe that there's only one instance in the state of Indiana where that has occurred. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's one of those great examples of something that exists on paper, and someone would check the box. I think Indiana gets full credit from the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools for having that policy in place. But then when you look at how it's actually working, what does it take to have a charter school actually get those surplus buildings? You find out that in the implementation, it's just not happening. I mean, the surplus facilities are never getting on the list, to be available to charter schools. So that's the kind of thing that this whole study and tool then leads one to think about, what are the best practices from other states? Like, why in California or in other states is a much higher percentage of charter schools able to do that? You find out that they have certain different things in their statutes, for example, that are making it so those schools, they're not being used for instruction right now, that were paid for by taxpayers, are more likely to get on the list, and that charter schools are more likely to be able to get those facilities. Again, something that doesn't cost the state anything. The state already paid, taxpayers already paid for those facilities. So I think that that's an example of something that I think we were all surprised at a little bit, to find out that this is something that exists on paper, that the state gets full credit for having on paper, but actually isn't having a big impact for charter schools in the state.
There's an audience question, and someone's reading my mind, because I had the exact same question in listening to you. I'll just read the question. You mentioned that the $1 rental or lease law has barely been used. Any idea why that law hasn't worked as intended?
Well, I wish I could say yes to that, but I wasn't aware that it had been used only once. So no, I'm not really aware on if you could answer that. But one thing I did want to mention is, are there things that we need to be thinking about more broadly when it comes to facilities that are not in use for whatever reason, and not just maybe school buildings, but when we look at the possible change that this whole situation with COVID is going to have from a long-term perspective, are there other facilities that are no longer in use that are owned by some level of government? Are there going to be community colleges that don't, for example, need as many facilities that they used to have, because maybe more kids and more young people are going to start doing virtual education? And so would there be some opportunities to take a look at other facilities, other buildings that exist that could be used, whether it's purchased or else rented, that would maybe open up the door for charter schools to have easier access to facilities? But Matthew, I'm sorry, back to the original question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that we've actually had some folks reach out to us since we published the report who have a lot more knowledge in Indiana, and they have given us some explanations. But I guess it does go to like the strength of the statute, and having the statute a little bit improved, so that if you have a building and a district is not using it for instruction, but is saying, we want to use it for some non-instructional purpose, does the state really want to allow that? I mean, this is precious space that's been used for classroom instruction. It's not being used now. Why not make it available? That seemed to be the intent of the statute to begin with, but other states have figured out just how to like remove some of the loopholes to kind of maximize that space. And I think the center's giving a great idea, which is there could be buildings that have been used for instruction outside of K-12, and I know some states do bring those in. So I think that's just an example of how this kind of exposes issues, and then we are allowed to kind of work with partners in the state to kind of go deeper in to understand what is causing the block on the ground, and then how does one improve both the underlying the policy itself and then the implementation of it. You know, some states, there's a state agency that really is in the leadership role of finding out and cataloging all those facilities that are out there that are not being used and making sure charter schools are aware of it. They're not relying on districts to say it themselves. And so I think those are just some of the things that I think Indiana could start exploring now that they have that piece of information that it's just not really having much of an impact. And also you see how in the tool that if the policy was improved, it would just do a much better job of helping charter schools in the state.
You know, I hadn't really thought about the issue of will there be additional capacity coming on, physical capacity coming online post-COVID. I've been kind of adamantly focused on the idea that let's look at what happens with instruction when we get back to the old normal, as opposed to fetishizing the new normal. And this may get beyond facilities, but it has me thinking. And this is a New York bias question because you know I have taught in New York City's charter schools where space is at a premium. We're up against a charter cap. There's no capacity coming online. It's not about buildings. It's about the charter cap. But is there an opportunity for charter schools to now expand the number of kids that they serve, families they serve on their existing charters, because they now have gotten good, as it were, at remote instruction? Can you serve more kids? It's not really a facilities question, but it's a question of getting more out of the facilities that you have.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea if that's even being thought about.
Yeah, I think if you're. Go ahead, Senator. Sorry, I'll go after you.
No, that's fine. I was just going to maybe delve in just briefly to the whole area of virtual education, because, and that's one thing we're still trying to figure out in Indiana, how best to do that. We have some traditional public schools that use virtual education. We have the charter schools that do, and then obviously because of the pandemic, most schools have some form of virtual education, and so we're still trying to figure out how best to figure out the funding mechanism when it comes to virtual, whether it's a charter school or not. And one thing I think we have to be careful of there is sometimes there's fits and starts when something new is kind of coming onto the scenes, and we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because sure, there's some possibility. We had some difficulties with a couple of schools that were set up, and it was essentially illegal activity that was taking place. And when it comes to virtual school funding, and we had some people that wanted to essentially, cut it out entirely or cut it back by 50%. And I just wanted to caution against that, because if you think about 10 years from now, again, is there going to be more or less virtual education going on? Well, I'm not a betting person, but I'd almost bet that there's going to be a lot more virtual education 10 years from now than there is today. And so we need to kind of figure out, how do we fund virtual education? And for that matter, how do we do a better job when it comes to charters when we're looking down into the future? Because again, it's important to focus on how can we best educate a child, and how can we help that family educate that child, no matter what that family chooses. That's what we always have to be focused on, and sometimes we lose track of that. And we just got to stay focused on that. It's very important.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matthew, I wanted to just go back to the fact that we're not talking about Indiana alone. So this tool, and forgive me that if you feel like you've already covered this, but I just want to be clear in my own mind how this tool can help policymakers in any state right now, or is it a matter of they have to contact ExcelinEd and say, hey, can you recreate this for us? I mean, how useful is this right now for folks who are not in Indiana?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think
explain this to me like you're one of my, like I'm one of my fifth graders. So keep it simple.
Okay, great point. I think that really it would be to be an example of what could be done in your own state to look at the Indiana, because it's very specific to Indiana. It's going to say 40% of needs are being addressed in Indiana, and this is what you could do in Indiana. So I think the real question is for folks in other states to say, would it be useful if this was done in their state? And when I say done, I mean it could be adapted to really address the specific needs that state policymakers or partners say exist. And I know ExcelinEd is really interested in doing this in other states. We want to have a sense that policymakers and partners see it as an important contribution, and that it's not just a report. I mean, obviously, this is a piece of information. It doesn't change the politics, that Senator Bassler and other policymakers have to deal with. It is a piece of information. If people feel like we already know it, or it's not going to change the politics, even if we did know it, that's not a great use of a tool or a report. And we also work very closely with partners in a state. That's why I said we worked with IQE in Indiana. They were a source of information to verify information, to help us understand who to talk to, who to get feedback from. So if a policymaker or partner in another state is interested, they just need to reach out, and I can put my contact information in the chat, and they could just reach out and say, hey, we're interested in exploring this, see how this could be useful. We've had other states say, well, this would be useful, but we want to have the operating funds in our state included in this, because it's really a big package for us. We see it as an equity issue. We want to know, is there a $2,000 gap on the operating? And now you're saying there's a $1,000 gap on the facility side. Well, that's a $3,000 gap. We want to see it all together. And we would say, great, we want to adapt this. We want to make this useful to another state. So I would just say, reach out to us if you think the index and tool would be helpful, and we can start a conversation.
Hey, Robert, one of the things I think we're trying to keep in mind is, and again, I love the report. It was a great report. Loved it. Read it from front to back. But what I liked even more was when I actually went online and started using the Excel spreadsheet, the tool that Matthew refers to, and even more than I guess. In some ways, I see the tool more than just the numbers itself that you're inputting and you're kind of changing and you're moving the different levels and see what impact that would have to do. Is that's led to a broader policy discussion when it comes to charter schools and what are some things, and for that matter, education in general. But what are some things that we need to be thinking about differently? And that's why that kind of led to the thought or the discussion a little bit about, let's look at facilities beyond just former school buildings, K-12 school buildings, as possible avenues that charter schools could use. So in some ways, the tool, I think, goes beyond just the tool itself and starts getting one or two or three or four or five people starting to think about, well, what about this, or what about that, or hey, we haven't thought about this, or yeah, sure, we need to improve this policy, but what about this entirely new issue or this entirely new policy maybe we could implement that might help. So it has the potential, and I would argue that it probably even has the potential to help people beyond Indiana, if for no other reason than to start a discussion, to start thinking about different levers that you can move to help educate children better.
A question from the chat. Does Indiana do an annual inventory of the use or vacancy of publicly owned facilities? Great question. Oh
boy, I don't know if we do an annual inventory. I know that there's an inventory that's available. I don't know how often that is updated, but I think that, again, that would be kind of a source, if you will. So let's see where these facilities are that aren't being used, because I believe it goes beyond just the K-12 schools and maybe any other types of facilities that are no longer being used. And again, could those be used even if they were, I don't know, a former, let's say a former armory building or something, or a former community college building or something along those lines?
The follow-up question I would have, and as somebody who's never been a school leader, but who knows school leaders who've gone through this process in New York of trying to hunt down space. And maybe, Matthew, this is a question for you. Does this tool work in both directions? In other words, if it turns out that there is an underuse of public facilities, well, does that tell me that the facilities are being underused, or there's a reason why they're being underused from the perspective of a school operator?
Yeah, I think what the tool is saying, like in Indiana, a certain percentage of charter schools are actually accessing the surplus buildings, and therefore it's addressing a certain portion of needs. In California, 45% of charter schools have accessed surplus. So they're paying no or low cost for facilities. So their entire, the state doesn't have to pay for their rent because they're not having to pay rent. So that's a huge benefit to the state and to the charter schools to be able to do that. So I think if you see a low percent, like much lower than California and Indiana, the question is why. I mean, you could say, well, there aren't any buildings available, that they just don't exist. But that's not
appropriate for the purpose that the school has in mind.
Say
right?
that again. I'm sorry.
Or I'm thinking of one friend of mine who a charter school founder in New York who I spent a year listening to him talk about how he couldn't find facilities, or when he found one, the cost of getting them to standards, to acceptable levels of that he could use for children was just prohibitive.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why, a state generally wants to put a premium on facilities that have previously already been used for classroom instruction, because then it's pretty easy to switch them over. But I do think that it's one of the reasons why we've talked about, like, a great option for a state is to help with the financing necessary to upgrade facilities like you're talking about. Again, it's a long-term huge benefit to charter schools to get into space that they have purchased, that they own, that they've invested in, they can grow in, they can stay in. They're not going to be pushed out if a district politics change or anything like that. So that's one of the things. And we show in the tool that the cost to a state to guarantee the bonds, the borrowing for a charter school to be able to do that is quite low, because they just have to pay for the very few defaults that happen over the course of 30 years. So the cost of the state is very small, but the benefit to the charter schools is huge, not only in terms of savings, but also just in terms of stability and growth. So they of course, could go into New York City if it's a district building that would require a lot of work. The question is who should pay for it. But I think that the question is, it is in New York City, with all the different buildings they have, or in a state with all the buildings they had that had already been used for classroom instruction. They previously used classroom instruction. Doesn't the state have an interest in making sure that as much of that space is still being used for classroom instruction, and that charter schools or nobody else is having to go and spend a ton of money to upgrade facilities to get them ready for classroom instruction, when right down the street there's a building that's just empty, there's no students in it at all, but 5 years ago it was used for classroom instruction?
Yeah, New York City, I always have to remind myself, is a bit of an outlier for many reasons as a charter community. I mean, the vast majority of charter schools in that city are so-called co-located buildings. So they are, to your very good point, Matthew, ostensibly classroom ready because they were classrooms. Not always. In the case I was describing a few moments ago, that was not the case, just because of the geography of the district involved. But yeah, the happiest people I know in the New York City charter community are those who have their own buildings, and they are rare. So, not seeing any more questions in the moderator chat. We can start to wrap this up. But I'm just curious, one or two more questions for each of you. For Senator Bassler first. So what were your main takeaways? You seem like you're a fan of this of the study and the tool, but not that you should be a spokesman for ExcelinEd to your fellow lawmakers. But what were your major takeaways for the tool and for the studies for state policymakers in Indiana and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it would be twofold. One was it in some ways kind of glaringly exposed some of the policies that aren't working particularly well. And obviously we want to know that if there's a policy that's been put in place and it's not working well, do we need to do away with the policy? Do we need to just modify the policy? Do we need to make significant changes in it to make it more effective? So that was one takeaway. And then I guess the other one was just the ease of use and the I think the opportunity that having something like that available can provide for people that are just kind of sitting around brainstorming. That's quite often where we get our best ideas, is when 2 or 3 people are just sitting around talking about a specific issue. And so I could envision, 2 or 3 people getting out this tool and just kind of plugging in some different numbers that then leads to not just the items that ExcelinEd has brought up on the tool, that could be some of the different levers that could be changed, but that can then lead to broader discussions. What are some other things that we're not yet thinking about? So that's probably the 2 or 3 biggest takeaways I had when I got online and started just really kind of, like I say, like any technology thing that there is today, the best way to learn about it is just to get around, hack around on it. You can't mess it up. So just go in and start plugging in some different numbers and start having some different discussions. If you were to move a few different things at one time, or one time just move one thing at a time, it can lead to some good discussions.
Matthew, same question. As the person who's responsible for the study and the tool, what surprised you about this work? When you, in other words, the journey from your, if there was one, from your preconceived notions to what you found out?
Yeah, one of the things was to see, like, of the different options that Indiana has, which ones really are going to cost the state a lot of money and which ones are going to cost less, are not a lot, but, like, they provide $750 per student for facilities. That's only addressing a fraction of the need, but let's say it went up to $1,250. There's still a big cost to the state of doing that. There's all these other options that really a state can do that are very low cost. And so the question would be, like, why not do those? Now that a state can see, well, these are things that could really help a charter school. It's not going to cost us much of anything. Why not explore those? And I just think that that's really important in an era, where we're probably, I don't know about specifically to Indiana, but generally, we're looking at tight fiscal times because of the pandemic. So I think that's a big issue. And I think that it wasn't only through the process of doing this project that people said that you really want to have this interactive tool. I mean, don't just do a report that just stays there. And so that's one of the things that's heartening to hear from Senator Bassler is this is what people told us at the very beginning, which is that if you make this interactive, if you allow people to go in and play around, it's going to be a lot more useful. It's going to have longer longevity for policymakers and partners down the road. And so I think it's heartening to hear that that's something that has been working. Again, we would want to change it, for another state because they might want to have different features. We're not like a contractor for a state. We want to do this, because it's part of our mission to kind of help put information in the hands of policymakers so they can do the best thing for students.
Great. You had mentioned this in passing, and let me just ask you to restate it, and then we can close with this. If there are policymakers or potential partners from other states who are interested in pursuing this work with you, how do they make that happen with ExcelinEd?
I think that the first thing they should just do is just email me. I don't know if someone could put my email into the chat, but also I'm online. It's matthewj@excelined.org, and we just love to hear, even if people are just giving us feedback to say this is how this could be improved, this is why we didn't like it. We want to make it better wherever we do it. But I just think that for anyone in a state that is interested in learning about it as an option, just reach out to us and we will then follow up. And we're just kind of curious always to learn about, like, what's been working in their states to kind of make information useful to policymakers. We're not traditional think tanks, so we just don't want to do studies that are sitting out there. We want to make it useful to drive actual change and try to understand, like, what would it take to get some information into policymakers who are really interested in maximizing the quality of instruction that's taking place in charter schools and making sure that their facility needs aren't distracting from that. That's really what we're interested in.
Terrific.
Matthew,
Robert,
Joseph? One of the things you have to keep in mind is to, I think you alluded to it earlier, I was just looking at the tool from kind of a state senator's perspective, a person that's involved with education policy from the state level and education funding. But I think that it would be a very valuable tool also for people that are not legislators, but people that are just proponents for charter schools and more robust funding for charter schools, and so I think that could be another area that would benefit greatly from just kind of logging on and taking a look at the tool.
Yeah, no, Matthew, you had me at every dollar saved on facilities goes into the classroom, because that's where I live and work. So that's a persuasive argument. I just want to thank you both for your time. This was personally interesting to me because, as I said up top, this is an area that is my own black box. So I appreciate both of you taking the time to walk me through it and to walk our audience through it. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Happy to.